Hello there. Today I'm taking a look at a white Burgundy. This is a Saint Romain from a producer called Alain Gras. It's the 2019, and this is a white Saint Romain. They do also make a red from a half bottle, you'll note. Now, Saint Romain, not necessarily one of the better known appellations of the Cotes de Beaune. Not a particularly large appellation. There's not a lot more than about 100 hectares or so of vines. And there are no premier crus or anything like that. So where are we? We're to the west of Monteley, and as you head west from there, you pass the vineyards of Auxey Duresses, and the next village you come to is the village of Saint Romain. And it's had its appellation status since 1947. The reason there are no premier crus is the fact that some of the vineyards go up to about 400 metres above sea level, so that the cooling effect of that sort of altitude means that in less warm years the wines here can be quite light and elegant, and from year to year there isn't necessarily the consistency to justify any of these vineyards being premier cru. However, it does mean that in a warm vintage such as 2019 they can actually produce some quite appealing wines, and these can often be quite good value. So Alain Gras, a reasonably well-known producer from the region, started his domain in 1979, and they like to describe their terroirs as being some of the best in Saint Romain, but they do have vineyards mostly towards the top of the hills, and the soils here are a combination of limestones and clays, with more limestone at the top and then more clay towards the bottom. As I say, the domain has its vineyards more at the top of the hillsides, and so those are the soils that tend to give more elegance and finesse to the wines. It's a small domain. It comprises 12 hectares of vines, so they make both red and white wines in Saint Romain. They also make reds and whites in Auxey Duresses, and then they have some vineyards in Meursault where they're making a white wine. This particular wine is 100% Chardonnay. The majority of white wines from Saint Romain are Chardonnay. However, you are allowed to blend in tiny amounts of Pinot Gris and Pinot Blanc, but very few producers do that, evidently. As I say, the typical soils here are a clay and limestone blend. The average age of vines for this domain is 40 years. There's a good level of vine maturity here, providing lovely concentrated fruit. The vineyards are managed sustainably, so they believe in tilling the soil rather than using herbicides to control the swathe between the vines. They'll practice green harvesting, so they'll control their harvest. If it's too high, they'll cut fruit and get rid of that to ensure that the fruit that's left will ripen adequately. Everything's picked by hand, and when they get to the winery, about 20%, maybe 20 to 30% of the fruit is destemmed, which means essentially it's largely whole bunch pressing, and that'll give you lovely clean juice. They're using pneumatic presses, so relatively gentle pressing as well. Fermentation and malolactic conversion goes on in French oak barrels. About 20% of those will be new every year. The wine ages in a combination. Some of it stays in barrel, and the remainder ends up in tank for 12 months, and that will be aging with its yeast lees as well, being stirred for a period of that time. So let's have a look at the wine, shall we? First thing I'd say is we've got a medium intensity of a yellowish colour here. I mean, it's an almost sort of slightly strawish yellow. It's not sort of bright and lemony. The fact it's a half bottle, it may have matured a little faster than it might have done in a full-size bottle. The wine has 13% alcohol, and it's actually quite readily forming tears on the side of the glass. They're quite pronounced, and they're running slowly down there. So, the wine seems quite viscous. So let's see what we make of the aromas, shall we? The aromas really are dominated by the leesy notes, so the wine aging with the dead yeast in the barrel and that being stirred up. So you've got some notes of oak, there are sort of underlying vanillary notes, but the majority of this, there's a creaminess, there are buttery notes, there are touches of butterscotch. So that's a richness, and that's all sort of sitting over sort of a peachy fruit, a relatively ripe but not overripe peachy note. So you've got that sort of citric, lemony top note and an underlying peachiness. So let's for taste. The wine is dry. There's some really quite mouth-watering acidity on the attack. Also very apparent at the first taste is there's a toastiness. And I think that toastiness is a combination of fermentation notes and the barrel aging. So there's a little bit of cedriness, there's a little bit of gunpowderiness, and that's emphasising some of this sort of really quite ripe stone fruit note. And it's perhaps riper than we saw on the nose. Sort of fairly ripe peach, and that's melding really quite nicely with the sort of creamy butterscotch notes to give it a sort of quite a rounded mid palate. It's relatively rounded, relatively rich. The wine's of medium weight. It's not huge, and there is this underlying freshness. But yes, there's some quite nice ripe fruit going on there. The mid palate is again creamy, butterscotchy, and there is a sort of a lemony freshness that lasts onto the finish, but the finish really doesn't have a lot of weight. Strangely though, the acidity means that it's actually lingering really nicely. So you've got the relatively tropical stone fruit aromas sort of giving way to the sort of creaminess, and then what you're left with persistently for the finish is a really delicate hint of creaminess, which is sort of cut with a lemony freshness. And strangely that's quite enduring, but it's not particularly rich. There's a delicacy to it and an elegance. I think the wine's drinking beautifully now. I mean, it's come out for 5 years old. I don't think it's a wine that needs any further aging. It's got a nice richness now, which is stopped from being fat by a good lemony, minerally crispness. But I think if it aged for a lot longer, that equilibrium might pass. At the moment, a really enjoyable example of a well-priced white Burgundy that I'm really quite enjoying. So thank you very much for watching. Hope you've enjoyed the tasting. If you have to, please press the like button. If you have any comments, please leave those in the comments box below. Your feedback's really valuable to us to let us know how we're doing. If you have friends you think might like to watch the video, please feel free to forward it to them. If you'd like to sign up and follow us, we'd very much appreciate that, and then that way you can set yourself an alert and always get a notification when we publish a new video. I will put a link to the Wine Searcher website in the comments box below, and that way you can find out the pricing and availability of the wine in your market, and also any other notes that we have around the wine. So thanks again for watching. I do hope you'll manage to find some time and come and join us for another tasting in the very near future. See you then.